dear students, to the massive open online course on international economics. In today's module, we are going to learn about financial globalization. Now, the basic objectives of this module are, we would like to explain first the concept of financial globalization and the underlying theoretical framework. We explore the theoretical arguments about how financial globalization would affect economic growth and volatility. We try to understand how financial openness is measured, and we also try to look at the pattern of financial globalization and finally delve at the composition of financial capital flow and its impact on economic development. Now, what is financial globalization? It is an aggregate concept that refers to increasing global linkages created through cross-border financial flows. The recent wave of financial globalization that has occurred since the mid-1980s has been marked by a surge in capital flows among the industrial countries and more notably between the industrial and the developing countries. Although capital flows had been associated with high growth rates in some developing countries, a number of them have also experienced periodic collapses in growth rates and significant financial crises that have been at a substantial macroeconomic and social costs. As a result, there has been an intense debate. This has emerged in both the academic and policy circles on the effects of financial integration on the developing economies. Let us try to understand the theoretical framework. The standard neoclassical framework views the key benefit of financial globalization as arising from long-term net flows of capital from industrial to developing economies. Because the former group of countries, that is the industrial nations, they are capital rich, while the latter, that is the developing countries, are generally capital poor. This should generate higher growth in the developing economies and welfare gain for both the groups. Perhaps not surprisingly, in the light of the corresponding literature on growth in closed economies, we generally find quite conflicting results in this case. So, in the newer literature, the main benefits to successful financial globalization are probably what we can call them catalytic and indirect. The benefits are not simply the result of enhanced access of financing for domestic investment. When viewed from this perspective, we will see that there is modest but increasing evidence that financial openness can in many circumstances result in the following situations. Number one, they can promote development of the domestic financial sector. Number two, they can impose discipline on macroeconomic policies. Number three, they can generate efficiency gains amongst domestic firms by exposing them to competition from foreign entrants. And lastly, they can unleash forces that result in better public and corporate governance. Thus, we can say that it can generate significant indirect, we sometimes call them collateral benefits. That is, in quantitative terms, they are likely to be the most important source for enhanced growth and stability for a country who are engaged in financial globalization. Thus, a simple understanding of the fact that the main benefits are likely to be catalytic rather than direct is already becomes a very useful guidance to the policymakers. The notion that financial globalization influences growth through these catalytic channels or the indirect channels that I just said has powerful implications for both empirical analysis of its benefits. Building institutions, enhancing market discipline, deepening the financial sector, all these things take time, as does the realization of growth benefits from such channels. This may explain why, over a relatively short period of time, it seems much easier to detect the costs that the economies get from financial globalization, but not the benefits. More fundamentally, even over long time horizons, it may be difficult to detect the productivity enhancing benefits of financial globalization. Because in certain empirical works, we do find out that if we include structural, institutional, or macroeconomic policy variables in various cross-country regressions, we find that it does seldom explain growth. After all, it is through these very channels that financial integration basically generates growth. Now, let us try to explain them separately. Now, growth. We begin with a very, very brief introduction to the basic theoretical argument about financial globalization, how they affect growth and volatility. Coming to the first one, that's growth. The simplest one, though it may sound to be very naive, we take a benchmark one sector neoclassical growth model which suggests that financial globalization should lead to flows of capital from capital rich economies to capital poor economies, because in the capital poor economies, the return of capital should be higher. In theory, these financial flows should complement the limited domestic savings in capital poor economies, and by reducing the cost of capital, they should allow for increased investment. Certain types of financial flows could also generate technology spillovers and other forms of organizational expertise from more advanced economies. Newer analysis emphasize more subtle and indirect channels. For example, when domestic residents are able to hold foreign assets, they can insure themselves against country-specific shocks to their income. This naturally allows for greater diversification of income risk, which can in turn encourage higher productivity and economic growth through greater specialization. In addition, financial flows could foster development of the domestic financial sector, and by imposing discipline on the macroeconomic policies, they can lead to more stable policies. To the context of volatility, we find that in theory, the effects of financial integration on output volatility are basically ambiguous in nature. Financial integration allows capital poor countries to diversify away from their narrow production bases that are often agricultural or natural resource dependent, thereby reducing some amount of macroeconomic volatility. At a more advanced stage of development, however, trade and financial integration could together allow for enhanced specialization. This could make the middle-income developing countries more vulnerable to industry-specific shocks and thereby lead to higher output volatility. If financial integration takes the form of heavy reliance on external debt, it could expose these countries to world interest rate shocks and thus to higher output volatility. Theory does have a strong prediction between the relationship between financial integration and consumption volatility, because consumers and by extension economies, they are risk averse, and so consumption theory tells us that they should desire to use the financial markets to insure against income risk, thereby smoothing the effects of temporary idiosyncratic fluctuations in income growth on consumption growth. We have here a chart where we try to show the financial globalization which yields collateral benefits. As you can see in this chart that I have a traditional view and I also have a different perspective. In the context of the traditional view, we find that there is financial globalization, and this basically leads to more efficient international allocation of capital. Rather, it's a capital deepening international risk sharing, and this ultimately leads to a rise in the GDP growth and a fall in consumption volatility. So the traditional view focuses on the importance of channels through which capital flows could directly increase the GDP growth and reduce the volatility of consumption. But on the other hand, if we try to look at a different perspective, this perspective acknowledges the relevance of the traditional channels. But it also argues that the role of financial globalization as a catalyst for certain collateral benefits may be more important in increasing the GDP or the total factor productivity growth and reduce the consumption volatility. So here, along with the traditional channel, we have the impact of the potential collateral benefit working on each other, ultimately leading to a rise in the GDP growth or a rise in the total factor productivity growth, and at the same time a fall in consumption volatility. Now, the most important task now that lies in front of us is how to measure this financial openness. The traditional approach to measuring financial openness is to use measures of legal restrictions on cross-border capital flows. Such capital controls come in many varieties. It can be controls on inflows versus those on outflow. It can be quantity versus quality control, restrictions on foreign equity holdings, and so on. So we have the IMF's annual report on exchange arrangements and exchange restrictions. They are called AREAER. This measures around 60 different types of control. Some researchers have also used a share measure reflecting the fraction of years in the sample in which a country's capital account was open. Other authors have also taken the detailed information that is available in the AREAER publications to construct the finer measures of capital account restrictiveness. Apart from the fact of measuring financial openness, what is another very important factor is to understand what do we really mean by de jure and de facto financial integration. Now, there is a distinction between them, and this distinction is really a very crucial one. After all, what matters is analyzing the effects of financial globalization is not how integrated economies seem on paper, pen and paper, but how integrated they are actually in real life, actually in practice. We have seen many Latin American economies, they have experienced massive capital flight at times during the last 2 decades, despite having controls on outflows. And China, we find, despite its extensive regime of capital controls, they have not been able to stop inflows of speculative capital in recent years. So, essentially, we should be more interested in trying to measure the de facto integration rather than just financial integration. So how do we try to go about measuring this de facto integration? One approach has been to look at the price-based measures of the asset market integration. The logic is that the integration of the capital markets should be reflective in common prices across national borders of similar financial instruments. But there are serious practical problems also in using such measures, mainly in the emerging economies and also in the less developed countries. Because returns on financial instruments in these economies may be incorporate within itself a multitude of risk and liquidity premiums that are really very difficult to quantify. And also domestic financial markets, they may simply not be deep or liquid enough to allow for efficient arbitrage of these price differentials. Now, if we try to understand how quantity-based measures of integration are used, they basically base it on actual flows, provide it, in our view, that basically provides the best measure of a capital's or a country's de facto integration with the global financial market. So, the actual flows, basically. So, should one measure integration using gross flows? What is gross flows? It is the sum of the total inflow and the total outflow. Or should they measure it by using net flows, which is a difference between the inflows and the outflows? Although this choice depends on the precise question on which the researcher is interested in, gross flows basically provide a less volatile and more sensible picture of integration. So basically they are saying that we should take the gross flows while measuring financial globalization or the openness of financial globalization. So indeed this measure has the advantage of capturing the two-way flows that one would expect to see if economies were sharing risk efficiently in a world with multiple financial instruments and agents with different risk profiles. However, annual gross flows tend to be volatile and prone also to measurement error. So to mitigate this problem, it is preferable to use the sum of gross stocks of foreign assets and liabilities as a ratio to GDP. So scholars are saying that this would be a better measure to measure the de facto financial globalization. Next, we come to the patterns of financial globalization. There has been a surge of financial globalization since the mid-80s. This has been found out mainly by the Lane-Milesi-Ferretti data that was out in 2001. Comparing the evolution of, say, two measures, one is the de jure integration based on the IMF's binary capital account restrictiveness measure, averaged across all countries in each group. And then there is a corresponding group average of the de facto financial openness measure, which basically measures the stock of international financial assets and liabilities expressed as a ratio to GDP. By both these measures, we found that advanced economies have become substantially integrated into the global financial markets. For emerging market economies, average de jure openness has not changed much based on the IMF measure, but de facto integration has increased sharply over the last 2 decades. So for other developing economies, de jure openness on average rose sharply to a level higher than that for the emerging market economies, but the de facto measure has stayed flat over this period. If we look at the FDI and the portfolio equity flows, they have become the dominant form of net flows into the developing economies, although debt still accounts for more than half of the stock of all external liabilities. The shares of debt in gross stocks of foreign assets and liabilities declined from 75% in 1980-84 to around 59% in 2000-2004. Amongst the advanced economies, the biggest increase has been in the share of portfolio equity. For emerging markets, the share of FDI and portfolio equity rose from 13% in 1980-84 to around 37% in 2000-2004, reflecting the wave of mergers and acquisitions, privatizations of state farms, stock market liberalizations that spurred flows to these economies in the early to mid-1990s. So recently we find accumulation of official international reserves has accounted for a significant portion of the increase in gross foreign assets of emerging and other developing economies. Consequently, the share of quote-unquote the other category has jumped. So, an alternative perspective on the growth and volatility effect of financial globalization is based on differentiating these various types of capital flows. And this is particularly relevant because the composition of international capital flows has really changed over time. of FDI, they have now become the dominant source of capital flows to the emerging market economies. As I have just said, equity flows have also risen in importance while the debt flows have declined. FDI and portfolio equity flows are presumed to be more stable and less prone to reversals, and they are believed to bring with them much of the indirect benefits of financial globalization, such as transfer of managerial and technological expertise. Debt flows, by contrast, are widely accepted as being riskier in particular, and the fact that they are pro-cyclical and highly volatile, they can magnify the adverse impact of the negative shocks on economic growth. So all these crises that we see in all the various economies of the world, is really financial globalization to be blamed? This is a question, that everyone wants to ask. And it's true that financial globalization has often been blamed for the string of damaging economic crises that rocked the number of emerging economies in the late 80s in Latin America and in the 90s in Mexico and a handful of Asian economies. The market turmoil and the resulting bankruptcies prompted a rash of finger pointing by those who suggested that developing countries had dismantled the capital controls too fast, leaving themselves vulnerable to the harsh dictates of rapid capital movements and market herd effects. Some were openly critical of the international institutions they saw as promoting capital account liberalization without stressing the necessity of building up the strong institutions needed to steer the markets whenever bad times hit them. So, in contrast to the growing consensus amongst academic economists that, there is a consensus that has grown that trade liberalization is good. It is beneficial for both the industrial and the developing economies. But when we come to the concept of financial liberalization or globalization, here comes the debate amongst the academicians and the practitioners about the cost and benefits of financial globalization. There are certain very famous economists like Don Roderick, Jagdish Bhagwati, Joseph Stiglitz. They view that unfettered capital flows are disruptive to the global financial stability, leading to calls for capital control and other curbs on international asset trade. Now, there are other economists also like Stanley Fischer and Lawrence Summers, and they argue that increased openness to capital flows has in general proved essential for countries seeking to rise from lower to middle income status, and that it has strengthened the stability amongst the industrialized nations. This debate, has considerable relevance for economic policy, especially given that major economies like China and India have recently opened up their capital accounts. If we look at this chart, because this chart is from the IMF publications, and they show how the countries are doing in various years, and here we see that despite crisis in some emerging market countries, these groups has outperformed other groups over the past 3 decades. So if we look at chart till 2004, as far as I can see here, and you can see in this chart, there is a yellow line. This yellow line basically are showing the emerging markets. That means we find that the per capita GDP in these emerging markets have increased, which shows that they have been growing. And if we look at the red line, that is the emerging markets where they've excluded India and China. There also, it's much higher up than the advanced economies or other developing economies. So, as we can see from the chart, that emerging market economies, the group of developing countries that have actively participated in financial globalization, have clearly registered better growth performance on average than those countries that have not yet participated. Yet, the majority of studies using cross-country growth regression to analyze the relationship between growth and financial openness have been unable to show that capital account liberalization produces measurable growth benefits. Now, one reason, of course, as I have been discussing all along, that how to measure financial openness. This is one of the major problems. To fail to measure financial openness. And then there's another, they also fail to capture how effectively countries exercise control, and sometimes these measures do not always reflect the actual degree of a country's integration with the international capital markets. Some progress in recent years have been made, but still we cannot say much. Now, there are no systematic evidence till now that really shows that financial integration is the proximate determinant of financial crisis that various economies experience. Authors, scholars have looked at different manifestations of such crisis, like it can be sudden stop of capital inflows or current account reversals or banking crisis, and they have found no evidence that countries that are more open to financial flows, they tend to have a higher incidence of these crises than those that are less open. So although these crisis episodes receive most of the attention, even media attention for that matter, they're just particularly the sharp manifestations of the more general phenomenon of macroeconomic volatility, which we know simply as macroeconomic volatility. So on that score, the results are less favorable. Financial globalization has not yet delivered on the promised benefit of improved international risk sharing and reduced volatility of consumption for the developing countries. We do not have any strong evidence till now to tell us that yes, countries who goes for financial globalization do really reap these benefits. But in sum, when we try to conclude about what exactly financial globalization, whether it has led to development or not, we can say that the effects of financial globalization have not yet been conclusively determined, although there is little formal empirical evidence to support the oft-cited claims that financial globalization themselves have caused financial crisis. This claim is also not really established. So the existence of any sort of robust macroeconomic evidence of financial globalization on positive impact on globalization is not there. That they are negatively impacted economies and leading to crisis, that is also not there. Okay, so the debate goes on in the context of financial globalization. Thank you.